to give a talk, I said, oh, good. I mean, right now, the Japanese and Koreans are fighting over colonial law and international law and stuff. So I will talk about that, I said. But then Alec, I think he was being kind of diplomatic, and he kind of gently reminded me that this is a center of English legal history. So I thought, okay, plan B. And we decided on this topic, custom. But then I asked myself, gee, what have I done? Huh? I said I would talk about custom to an audience in England. It would be like, what's the other old expression? It would be like a carrying coal to Newcastle or something like that. And then, and also I thought, gee, the Professor Iverson will be in the audience. And what was I thinking to volunteer to talk about custom? So I had this momentary panic, but then I thought, well, my research is on custom in France, not in England, mainly on this legal fragmentation in ancient regime France. Now I will put up a map here. Now this is basically this map. This is a map from the 19th century, but this is a map of custom in France. Now all these lines are separate customary law boundaries. And then here you see a kind of important country there. So perhaps I thought I could say one or two things about the differences between England and France. And as someone who's based in the US, who teaches in the US, I could talk about the state of research in French legal history in the US. And then finally, as Alec said, as someone who does research in both European and East Asian legal history, I could talk about what custom is in East Asia or what custom is not in East Asia from a comparative perspective. So these are the topics, the main topics I would like to touch on this afternoon. Now, first, I would like to talk about maybe some difficulties I often face in my research. It is about the concept of custom. It is often difficult for me in talking with colleagues, mostly who are not legal historians, I would say general historians. And when I try to explain what custom in legal history means, often it's difficult. I think that this word or term custom in English language can be a little bit tricky. Historians tend to view custom with some romantic appeals, or almost with some nostalgia, like something with the popular consent, or the custom as rules made by people, or the rules from below, not imposed from above, and so forth. That's a general view of custom. Well, I think there is some truth in these views, but of course, this kind of idea does not help very much in legal history. Well, in France, of course, many people tend to forget that the French Civil Code existed for only about 200 years or so. Whereas now for many hundred years before 1804, from the 13th century now through the end of the 18th century, France did not have a unified law. Instead of civil code, now private legal relations were governed by a very disorganized mass of custom, la coutume, along with Roman law and canon law and royal edicts and ordinances. So the concept of custom, what is the custom in ancient regime France? What was la coutume? That's the first question that I have. Well, I think this confusion that I'm talking about, I think we can probably blame medieval doctors. Medieval doctors said popular consent was an element essential for custom as a law, opinio necessitatis. But the problem is then how do we prove this thing called the popular consent? Now, one way of proving consent is that a rule is observed. That is, when a rule is recognized as obligatory and observed by people, then there must be a excuse me, consent. But then, well, a rule is observed because it is a rule, and then consent, or you might say forced consent, follows after the fact. In other words, the rule exists, the rule comes first, and then the consent is acquired. But shouldn't it be the other way around? So the medieval theory of custom was at best circular. Now that is what French legal historian Robert Jacob said. It's a circular. So for him, this medieval neglect to clarify about consent gave rise to the so-called myth of custom. Now, I will be talking about several myths in this talk. You know, the historians love a myth, like, you know, busting myth. There is a long debate among French historians about the custom, about the question of a common law, the droit commun. The two factions, you would say, now they disagree over whether there existed, say in 13th century France, the general legal principles, customary in nature, with nothing particularly Roman. So one group says the French custom were written down in coutumier and well before the penetration of Roman law. And the French private law took place, emergence of French private law took place largely free from Roman law. Others, by contrast, highlight, of course, the changes brought by the introduction of corpus juris civilis. For them, the notion of droit commun appeared in France only as a result of the intellectual breakthrough caused by Roman law. And they claim that this uncritical acceptance of the notion of a popular consent has perpetuated a myth of custom. One way of looking at this question would be to see, well, how French experience compared with those in the rest of Europe. Now, we know the influence of Roman law was minimal in England, well, compared with France, that is. And the other end of a spectrum is Holy Roman Empire. Now, Holy Roman Empire was the only entity in medieval Europe that granted Roman law the status of the common law. So this very sweeping nature of the recognition rendered the formulas like jus commune or Gemeines Recht quite flexible. In France, which never recognized Roman law as its droit commun, was a completely different story. We know French legal humanists attempted reassessing the place of jus commune in France. And I believe this whole enterprise of French legal humanism was a historical exercise that took place against the backdrop of the royal effort to record the customs from the late 15th century. This map shows various jurisdictions in France about 15th century and on. Again, England was unified much earlier than France, but in France it was not until the end of the 15th century, in the aftermath of the 100 Years' War. So only after the English went home, then the French kings were able to bring the last of feudal principalities under royal control. So with the recovery of royal power, as you see here, these provincial parlements were created in the newly added territories. So Parlement of Toulouse and the South Languedoc, Grenoble, Bordeaux, Dijon, now they were all set up between the 1440s and the 1470s. And these different courts ruled according to their own customs. In 1454, Charles VII issued his famous edict, famous ordinance of Montilletour, to declare the royal campaign to record and reform customs. France was not unique in doing this, of course. Now, collection and standardization of customs took place in different parts of the continent, but nowhere was it carried out in the same scale and intensity as in France. Coutumes were now drawn up in the assembly of 3 estates in each bailliage, and then were promulgated in the name of the king. And then the text was printed, disseminated, and deposited in the Parlement. And through this process, the custom became a formal body of written laws, just like royal laws. And the king said, invoking any customs different from those in the official text was prohibited. I believe the role of lawyers in the process was quite important. Indeed, the whole campaigns to record the customs were a collaboration between the lawyers and the crown. I remember, well, Professor Iverson is in the audience, but I remember he once wrote that lawyers were always wholly conscious of the political realities of their own time. I think that's just the case here. Christophe Dutu was the main force behind the recording of the customs throughout the second half of the 16th century. He was the president of the Parlement of Paris, and his family, his career was a product of the sale of offices in France. I think it is very true that the recording of customs not only saved the French customary law as a category, but also saved its practitioners, that is, lawyers, as a profession. So, Coutume de Paris, which was first written down in 1510, was revised in 1580, and you see the cover of the text. This map shows the dividing lines between all just the different customary law jurisdictions. Now, this thick line indicates the line between the Pays de Droit écrit in the south and the Pays de Droit coutumier in the north. So the region of written law in the south and the region of customary law in the north. Now, in the South, Roman law was regarded as one of the general customs. In the North, the coutume issued by the king became the law in defined territorial areas, and each coutume was binding on all inhabitants, clergy, nobility, and the third estate within its boundaries. But you see the problem here in this map. At the closing of the 16th century, there were 65 general customs, the coutume générale, and some 300 local customs, coutume locale, across the kingdom. Now, this map only shows selected general customs. So beyond this, there were hundreds more different pockets of the customary law areas. So this is what France had from late 16th century all the way through the end of Ancien regime. You can say this is like a crazy quilt of laws, which changed little until the French Revolution. Now, I mentioned earlier about the confusion surrounding the term custom. There is a certain, we may call it the semantic confusion. And it seems like already in the late 16th century, people complained about this term custom. I'll give an example of Le Garon. Louis Le Caron, known as Sharon Das, it was a French jurist, and he mightily complained about the term custom, la coutume. He said, well, after customary laws were written down in the late 16th century, pays de coutume in the north and center of the kingdom became really the pays de droit écrit, written laws with the codified laws, whereas now pays in the midi, in the south, became in effect the pays de coutume, because the use of Roman law there had been allowed by the king to have force of law only as custom. So he says, to continue calling the written text of coutume custom after the 16th century only increases confusion. I think he had a point. But despite his protest, the older designation of pays de coutume in the north and pays de droit écrit in the south continued. So, well, Le Caron may have exaggerated a little, but it seems like he had a sense of foreboding about the ambiguity of the term, which would indeed cause grief to generations of historians for the next several hundred years, even to this day. In any case, we see the point he tried to get across, that the promulgated customs became quasi-legislation. Exclusive lawmaking power was an essential element of the conception of a royal sovereignty and the so-called absolute monarchy in France. Now here, if you allow me, I will digress a little bit and briefly touch on the historiographical debate on absolute monarchy. Hot topic among especially the US historians, it seems. Now, the idea of royal absolutism has taken much fire these days. The conventional view of absolutist monarchy was that the Bourbon kings, Louis XIV, tamed and disciplined the ruling elite class. But recent scholarship has rejected such idea as the, well, myth of absolutism. So here is another myth. Here. Well, historians can't resist. They like to talk about the myth. Revisionist historians say, well, forget about Louis XIV, forget about the l'état c'est moi, nonsense, they would say. And they say the Bourbon kings had to seek cooperation of local powers. But this revisionist view itself has been criticized, that they were treating the idea of absolutism as a sort of a caricature. And this is what the late Professor Richard Bonney said. He said, the term absolutism was a neologism dating from the French Revolution, but the term absolute power was widely used in the Middle Ages. And I like this. Professor Bonney wrote that John Locke was responsible in part for what he called English mythology and the demonology of absolutism by confusing absolute government with arbitrary government. And I read Professor J.H. Burns once counted, actually, and the phrase absolute arbitrary power, equating the two, occurred 7 times in Locke's treatises of government in 1689. So then the 19th century historians uncritically accepted that and identified the absolute monarchy as absolute monarch as an autocrat or despot who was the enemy of popular consent and commoners' rights and liberties. What about the relationship between the reduction of custom and the absolute monarchy? It has been argued that absolute monarchy undertook the revision of the Paris custom in 1580 and elsewhere, mainly because it wanted to maintain the integrity of feudal fiefs. Now, this is a view that absolute monarchy was an instrument of feudal domination of Marxist historians, such as Perry Anderson. But in fact, as I read the revised Gujim, the text, it seems the revised Gujim attempted to regulate and limit certain allegedly immemorial feudal customs, like various feudal dues, saying that they should not be automatically recognized because they might be immemorial, but in reality, they were mere usurpation. So I would argue that the codification customs may not have been a social war against the feudal hierarchy, but it was not a reactionary conspiracy either. To claim absolute power, the king, of course, first had to redefine feudal privileges, as well as local entitlements and immunities, while promising to respect his subjects' property rights in custom. 14th century nominalist theologians put forward the notion of potentia absoluta of God, distinguishing between the potentia absoluta and the potentia ordinata. So the idea is God has created the world in this way, although he could have created it differently. And as God freely limited his power, so does the king. Jean Gaudin captured this idea. As you see in this quote, he said, the king who's not subject to law, any law other than natural law and the God's law, still promises that he would observe his own laws. Royal policy of customary law seems to attest this idea, the idea that old-fashioned idea that the law reinforced by royal authority afforded better protection for the less than mighty subjects. I think that idea captures probably the relationship between custom and so-called absolute monarchy. And I think this is the real significance of customary law reduction. Another British historian that I greatly respect, the Professor Robert Knack of University of Birmingham, has argued that the reign of Francis I should be seen as an absolute monarchy. And I think the recording of customary law in the 16th century supports that view. Anyhow, few attempts were made after 1600 then on custom or the customary law. The Bourbon kings were not interested in dealing with custom. They would rather rule with the edicts and ordinances because the custom was cumbersome. Once recorded and published by the Parlement, then it could not be easily changed because imagine convoking the three estates and then going through revisions by popular agreement. It was a very time-consuming process, very cumbersome, and the Bourbon kings, with a short patience, had no desire to go through that. As a result, the maze of customary law map drawn at the end of the 16th century continued pretty much till 1789. But of course, there were numerous complaints about this crazy fragmentation of custom. This map. And one of them was Voltaire. Who else? He was one of the ones who mildly complained about the state of law in France. Now here I put some of his numerous quips on custom and status of law in France. Now we can feel that he was fuming. The last one, quote, a man who travels in this country changes laws almost as many times as he changes horses at a travel station. Now this famous quote, well-known quote, comes from his Dictionnaire philosophique. This is probably the most famous one, but I would like to draw attention to one of his less known satire, my favorite, dialogue between a client and a lawyer. Some of you might already know this, but this is not very well known. It's a very short piece. It's only 3 pages long, but delightful, I mean, quintessentially Voltairean piece. Basically, it's a dialogue. A lawyer and a client discuss their case, and the lawyer kind of scolds the client for impatience when lawyer says, well, only 18 years have passed from the beginning of the lawsuit, and only 1/3 of the client's fortune has dissipated in court fees. So you should be more patient, he says. And the lawyer explains that, quote, with no Roman law sufficiently explicit in a case like this, we turn to several different opinions, lawyer says. The client is skeptical and says, well, why are you talking about Roman law? Are we living under Justinian or Theodosian? The lawyer replies, well, no, but, he says, our ancestors really loved hunting and tournament, and they would run around with their mistresses. You see, when they have such important occupations, it does not leave you much time to establish a universal jurisprudence, unquote. So client seems to get it, right? And he says, oh, gee, I see. So we don't have the laws, and then we go to Justinian and ask what should be done when you have an inheritance to divide and settle. Well, wrong. The lawyer says. No. In fact, we have more laws than all of Europe combined. Almost every town has its own laws. Then here comes the punch line. The poor client, then totally confused, asked the lawyer why France could not have one law and one measure system as in England. Lawyer, of course, has a ready answer. This is his answer. Don't you see that English are barbarians? They use the same measuring system, but they have in turn 20 different religions, he said. And well, London, became worthy of being inhabited because it had been destroyed and rebuilt after the Great Fire. So just like that, lawyer says, if you want good laws, burn the ones you have and then make new ones. Well, we know this is what French did. They burnt down the ancient regime and the customs along with it, and then started anew with the civil code. Now here is my final myth, but with a question mark. There exists an enormous amount of literature in French language on custom. In comparison, custom in early modern France has triggered only a limited interest among Anglophone historians, now other than medieval custom. And there are as yet a few discussions in English of English language of custom and its codifications in France. This lack of interest can be ascribed to many things, but one of them is that during past decade or so, the scholarly field of early modern France in the United States has taken a definite social and cultural turn. Historians have turned their back to the so-called traditional political and institutional history, faulting its allegedly top-down and center-focused approach. The majority of works by American historians, at least since the 1980s, are heavily focused on gender, daily life, and the family history. And this dominant scholarly interest in social and cultural history then comes with the belief that legal history too would be amiss, deficient, without references to extra-textual realities, that is, social practices. This then has had the effect of playing down the significance of the sources of law and the value of juristic and jurisprudential activities. Legal history ideally discusses how local population perceived the laws and how they reacted to them. But as another British historian, J.P. Cooper, once said, well, it is difficult enough to establish what the law allows, and far more so to relate this to what people actually did, and how far their intentions were sustained by the court. When the field of early modern French history has become a bit lopsided for the social and the cultural history in scholarship in English, especially in the US, I think a legal history focusing on the sources of law and learned argument may be worth paying a little attention to. So far, I have talked about historiography, but one more thing. Now, I said earlier that the French people have often hard time remembering that the civil code is only 200 years old. Well, countries elsewhere, the countries in East Asia, for example, is more problematic. The countries in East Asia had sophisticated law codes dating to the 7th century. So there was no room for development of customary law at all, because there was no need. So I'd like to briefly discuss how now this concept of custom as a source of law, an idea born in Europe, spread outside of Europe. The notion, the concept of custom was an import. It spread to East Asia in the late 19th century. It was a very conscious import from Europe by Meiji Japan, or we might call it legal transplantation. Now here, I provided the text from different codes, different civil codes in different countries. Now, the first one is from Meiji Japan. The law in 1875. That was the first time that Japan declared the custom a source of law. 1875, so this was more than 30 years before the Swiss Civil Code. Swiss Civil Code, which recognized custom as a source of law in 1907. As you can imagine, the Japanese are very proud of the fact that they were much earlier than the Swiss. Meiji Japan was heavily influenced by Savigny and German historical school, but its reason for accepting custom as a source of law was rather instrumental, I would say. That is, it was for specific goal of legal modernization. In the name of custom, traditional local practices as usages, traditional Japanese practices and usages were interpreted and classified by judges in terms of newly imported European, French and German legal principles and categories. In this way, custom eased the gap between the pre-existing indigenous legal order and the new imported European system. We see that this was not actually very different from what had happened in France. So from medieval France to Meiji Japan, attention to custom took place in the context of external stimulus of alien law, Roman law in medieval France, and the French law in Meiji Japan, and also in the context of a conscious effort of the state to unify legal sources and centralize the kingdom. As soon as the Japanese created a civil code, that was in 1898, they then quickly dropped the custom as a source of law. Again, we know the French and the Germans did pretty much the same. Well, custom lived, that is, in the colonial context. The concept of custom as law spread to Korea and Taiwan, both of which were Japanese colonies. So today, custom is an official source of law in Korea and Taiwan, obviously adopted verbatim from the major law above. The language of Article 1 in both Korean Civil Code and the Taiwanese Civil Code is the same as 1875 Japanese law at the top. Why did these post-colonial civil codes recognize custom as a law, custom as a source of law? It attests to the nationalistic desire to highlight their autonomous legal traditions, something free from the influence of outside law. You know, Koreans are very nationalistic people, but the Korean law was very much influenced by Japanese colonial law. So we will make our Korean custom as a source of law. That's basically what the Article 1 is in the Civil Code. I'm ready to wrap up my talk here. I'm I'm a little bit sheepish in doing this, but if you kindly allow me a little bit of self-promotion, forgive me. I would like to just inform you of my book, which will be forthcoming, not yet out, but basically what I said this afternoon is from this book. And mainly, I pointed out some misconceptions of law in Ancien regime France. To recap, above all, I think this widespread quaint view of custom as something pristine and folksy, popular norms sustaining a self-produced social order is of little help. Historians are inclined to highlight the representative or even democratic nature of the local assemblies that recorded the custom in France. But here again, I cannot do better than quoting other historians, this time quoting the late Professor Alan Watson. He said that when people defended their custom, they did so because it granted them privileges, and not because it contained the good old norms derived from their habitual behavior. So my take is, we have no reason to think that there was greater consensus in the medieval and early modern times than there is in our own about what social and moral values were acceptable in the community and how individual behavior could be made to conform to them. And finally, from a comparative perspective, I believe history of custom provides a valuable framework for an understanding of law across legal systems and legal traditions. And the spread of civil law through the medium of custom has indeed a long and deep history in the West, and also in the West. In the West and also in the East. Well, I'm done. Well, Alec told me that it is customary to go to dinner after this talk. But I suppose it's just my luck, right? So pandemic defeats custom. Well, so. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a brilliant talk. And now this is the point where we usually go on to questions. But before we do, I'd just like to say that this talk is being recorded and it's going to be put on YouTube. But if anyone has any problems with that, please email us and we'll sort it out. Great. So Professor Kim, if you could stop sharing your screen, we'll take questions from the audience.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thanks.
Is it okay now? Or
wait. Oh, it's confusing.
No, is my. I'm sorry. Is my PowerPoint still shows up? Or
kind of like a Campbell's soup can advert. We've got the Zoom. We've got the Teams call within the Teams call here via your shared screen. I think it's
okay. How about if I turn this off?
Any ideas, Doug?
How is that now?
We seem to be getting it in a smaller window. Let me see. If you want to start with questions, I'll go ahead and see if I can.
Yeah. Okay. So David, if you want to ask your question, go for it. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Kim. That was interesting. I think we have a theoretical problem about what we're talking about. But if we go back to the Middle Ages, it's perfectly clear, I think, we've got two separate binaries that we need to think of. You have a binary between law and custom. Custom is that which is not simply law, and it's justified in terms of this is what we do, whereas law tends to be justified by reference to identifiable texts. And then, as you see very clearly in France in the late 15th century, you have a binary between written law and customary law. So there you've got an idea of law, which is there. Sometimes the law is being defined by reference to typically Roman law in the continental European tradition. But then you've also got, as you find in France very obviously, types of law which are written down, which are there in books, which can be consulted and which give Voltaire hypertension. They're still law, but they count as customary law. It's what we do in a sense, but it's identified by reference to the written text. So what we're seeing is a movement within legal thinking towards having some externally verifiable source for propositions of law. And I think that actually provides us with some sort of framework in which we can try to make sense of this, this duality between things we regard as law and things we want to regard as custom. Mm-hmm. But what I'm really interested in is East Asia. So you got the Tang Code in the 7th century, and you leapt from there to, was it 1873? There's quite a lot of time between the early 7th century and 1873, when certainly in China, and I really don't understand what's happening in Japan, and I have no clue at all what's happening in Korea, that you've got an idea that this code is there as a system of state regulation, but you still have got a huge range of dispute settlement, as I understand it, which takes place with local officials and not really working within the what we would think of as the imperial system, which is there in the Tang Code and its derivatives. So do we actually have any information in any East Asian country that you know of about how disputes that fall outside the code are being regulated, how they're being decided? Not simply what the mechanism is for deciding them, but what results are being reached. Is there any consistency in those results? Before we get the Meiji revival in Japan, before we get the codification of law along the Western model in China? Sorry, that was rather a long question.
No. Yes, I think that's a very important and interesting question. I really hope that many more people get interested in this East Asian law. Now, Tang Code, yes, dating from the 7th century, and then as each different dynasty, the imperial dynasty came in, then they all then codified their laws again. So we have then the Yuan Code or the Mongols, and then have a Ming Code, and then have a Manchu Qing Code. So these codes were always there since the 7th century, and they were spread, they were imported, that is, to Korea first and Japan. So Korea had a very well organized code as well, just like the Tang or the Ming Code. But then what was the nature of this code? It was a penal code. It was not a civil code at all. So all these East Asian countries had a code, but it was penal and administrative laws, not the civil code at all. Indeed, some of the provisions dealt with some civil matters, like how do you divide inheritance? What do you do in selling slaves and so forth? So there are very few provisions there. But then what happens if some dispute arrive among the private citizens, among the what we call the private matters? Then the result is always, well, the magistrate decides on one side or the other, that those decisions were really always made on the basis of fact, because there was no jurisprudence or the doctrinal activities at all. And so therefore, it is always the question of who's telling the truth and who is not. So based on the fact, the decisions were made and the penalty follows. So there is no difference, this distinction between the civil matters and the penal matters. And that's basically what has been during these centuries. And when the magistrate hears the two sides of the stories, and his main goal is to decide who's telling the truth, and then who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. So based on this, I would say, Confucian belief of human dignity or integrity, whatever. So that's the main goal of the magistrate or the trials, to restore harmony so the people don't fight anymore. So I would like to say that, of course, the contract existed. Well, the inheritance had to be divided. However, contract law did not exist. Inheritance law did not exist. So that's, I believe, the main difference between what we call the, well, in laws in Europe and in East Asia.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thanks. And if I may follow up on that, would that mean there was massive sort of regional variation? I mean, would it actually be possible to appeal from a magistrate? And if so, how would they do so without any clear standards on what was a correct or incorrect decision?
When there is no law to go by, well, we have to admit that much of it depends on magistrate decision. And I think that was the case. The again, who's a good guy and who's a bad guy. And even when, well, some property was sold, somebody cheated, well, who's a good guy, who's a bad guy? So in that sense, the sentiment, human sentiment, played a much bigger role in such circumstances because of the lack of standards that you have to go by.
Thanks. Go ahead, David.
Sorry, I'm sorry to come back again, but I think that doesn't work, Professor Kim. That works against a Confucian background. But if you think of international merchant contracts, which you've certainly got in China, at least in the Tang, it cannot be the case that if you've got a merchant who's coming from Central Asia entering into a contract with somebody in West China, when a dispute arises, and we know they had written terms for these contracts, which must indicate there was room for dispute, it cannot simply be that the dispute is resolved by somebody saying who's the good guy. There has to be some idea of substantive rules that will work. And I think this is at least one of my big problems about trying to understand Chinese legal history, because you've got the penal code, which is there, we can see that. But the civil or commercial law has got to have some concrete source. And as far as I know, we can't see, or at least I don't know, I haven't been able to find out what it is.
Perhaps the way of looking at it is the difference between, say, judicial activities and administrative activities. Indeed, there were provisions or the guidelines for the magistrate to decide the commercial dispute, but it was done as part of administration rather than as part of judicial activities. And the Tang, of course, Tang Empire, the commercial contact with the rest of the world was widespread. But then soon, as we know, Ming closed it up. And for many centuries, at least from 1500 or 14 some, all the way till the 19th century, it just closed up the country and no contact whatsoever with the rest of the world. So the importance of once important is commercial law didn't have much opportunity to develop as elsewhere. I exaggerated a little bit, of course, when I said the magistrate had to decide which is a good guy or a bad guy. But my point was mainly the cases were decided on the basis of the fact. So the distinction between legal questions and the factual questions was not as clear as in Europe.
Great. And Doug, if you want to ask your question.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Professor Kim. It was a fascinating talk. I just have it's a bit of a broader question, and admittedly, my kind of knowledge in this area is fairly limited to English legal history. But I did want to ask, you discussed centralization and its interaction with the maintenance of customary law. And, you know, given in the English context, the centralization of English law, of customary law under Henry II, you know, kind of giving rise to the common law and the 12th century seemed to have a beneficial aspect on its maintenance going forward. I was curious, I know it's a difficult kind of what if question, but would centralization of French law in the medieval period, in your opinion, have perhaps led to a more robust and sustainable model that could have survived, excuse me, into the modern period, perhaps, or would that really have not made too much of a difference?
Mm-hmm. Well, centralization, I mean, much later in France than in England, really didn't start until after 100 Years' War, wasn't it? Say 1440s and the 1450s. Well, of course, there was someone like Philip II, which is much earlier. Philip II, who's the contemporary of King John and so forth. Yes, he was very active. Well, he managed to get all the continental land from England and so forth. So there was a great increase in the royal power. But now, that was in the 13th century, and that really, that momentum, if you will, was stopped, well, suspended during the wars, and really started in the 15th century. Now, one of the things that I mentioned was about this notion of absolute monarchy. As I said, I think, in my opinion, the main problem, if you will, or the disagreement that I have is that these so-called revisionist historians tend to say, well, absolutism didn't exist in the medieval period. I don't think that is very accurate here, because, well, the authors, Fortescue and so forth, plenty talked about absolutist power and absolutism and so forth. So these 19th century historians, in their desire to, highlight this liberty and so forth, almost misconceived the notion of this absolute power, which was very much in force in the late medieval period.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Christopher, if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just thinking, I mean, I know very little about these multifarious French customs, and then what's the kind of scholarly consensus at the moment about the degree of difference and the nature of the differences between them? I mean, do they tend to converge? You know, do different local customs tend to follow a similar patterns in different regions, or is it the view that there are significant and potentially problematic contrasts in important areas of law between them, or can we see common patterns?
Yes, in that country, when you have, say, 300 different customs, it can't be all different. Indeed, some there were very much overlapping aspect. So in the 16th century, so these legal humanists really tried to promote this idea of customary common law, or the dragome kuchumie. So it's a customary law, or because by definition it's all different regions, but there must be there is a overlapping, coinciding aspect, very much so. So indeed it was Charles Dumoulin in the 16th century. He really came up with this idea, and he wrote a treatise called The Oration of the Concord of French Law. He said, well, we can come up with a common customary law when we add all this, collect all these similar things together, and then we convince these little jurisdictions to part with their customs and adopt these common laws. But of course, as you can imagine, there's much of this so-called common law is based on Paris. The Parlement of Paris, the Coutume de Paris, and of course, Dumoulin was very much a fan of Paris Coutume. So he believed that we can create a customary common law on the basis of Parisian, the custom. But there was a substantial opposition, like Guy de Coquille. He was very much active in this regional autonomy. Well, say, well, they didn't like to have this custom of the capital to invade into their own, the local custom. So this idea of a common customary law, yes, pretty much remained on paper, but the idea was there. To create a common law, just in the model and a model of England, as they would have liked. But it didn't pan out because, well, I guess there would be many different reasons. But I think one of the reasons is, once they, in the 16th century, printed out all these different customs in writing, then once you do that, then it becomes very difficult. The power of writing, if you say. Once you have done that, that's what they did in the 16th century. And then, it will be just too much work. So they'd rather, we'll live with that until the French Revolution.
Okay, great. Do we have any other questions? Nope. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kim, for that talk and for answering some of those difficult questions. Before I end this meeting, just like to say that the next talk is going to be from Tom McSweeney on Priests of the Law. Read the book. I can confirm it's going to be very exciting and interesting. So I look forward to seeing a lot of familiar faces next time.
Thank you
for attending, and thanks for the talk.